Washington Journal continues.
We are joined by Mark Krikorian, who is the Executive Director for the Center for Immigration Studies, joining us to talk about the Biden administration immigration policies. Mark Krikorian, welcome. Tell us about the purpose of your organization and your funding.
Well, we're a think tank. There's hundreds of them here in Washington, of course. We make the case for an immigration policy that is enforced and it results in lower levels of immigration overall. And we're the only think tank on that sort of pro-enforcement, low immigration side of the debate. The other think tanks in this field all pretty much are connected to some industry or another, the immigration lawyers or the tech firms or what have you. And our funding mainly comes from big foundations. We don't do the kind of direct mail fundraising that more activist groups do, and there's nothing wrong with that, but because we're not a mass citizen organization, we don't do that kind of mass retail fundraising that other organizations, for instance, Numbers USA, which is an activist group on this issue, they do that kind of thing.
You have written 2 books on immigration in the last 2 decades, including one on the Obama administration's efforts on immigration. If you were to look ahead and think about potential writing a book on the Biden administration, what do you think your take on what you've seen so far on the Biden administration would be?
Well, I think pretty soon we're going to be yearning for the good old days of the Obama administration, because the current administration's approach actually seems to be much more anti-enforcement than the Obama administration. For instance, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, the second one under Obama, was actually quite serious about, for instance, security-related, national security-related measures. And I'm skeptical that we're going to see that in this administration. And the enforcement priorities of this administration, where, for instance, right now, and this is in court, the Biden administration has said no one's going to get deported for the next 100 days, with certain very limited exceptions, which are almost certainly going to carry over into sort of, the post-100 days period of enforcement. And it includes basically an exemption from immigration enforcement for illegal immigrants who have committed all but the most serious crimes, and which means that illegal immigrants who have committed pretty serious crimes, I mean, drunk driving being among them, but a lot of others, including, fraud, money laundering, all kinds of things, when and if they finish their state or federal criminal prison sentences, they'll just be let back onto the streets, even though they're illegal immigrants and should be deported when their sentences are finished. So the Obama administration was, in fact, pretty lax as far as immigration goes, immigration enforcement, but the Biden administration looks to be considerably more lax.
What do you think, looking back to the Trump administration, what do you think the legacy on immigration, his record, will be?
Well, it'll be the Trump administration's legacy has a few blemishes, but overall, it's actually it was really quite constructive. Now, they were slow to get started on a lot of things. Out of the gate, they announced the travel ban, which was widely derided as a so-called Muslim ban, even though that's not what it was. It was actually, even though it was badly rolled out at the beginning, it ended up being a very important and constructive tool that did not seek to ban people because of what religion they were, that sort of thing. It was actually attempting to hold countries responsible for cooperating with us so we could do the kind of background checks on visa applicants that we need to be able to do in order to make sure that we're not letting bad guys into the country. So, and that pattern of a good idea that initially was kind of, implemented badly, but ended up being done well and really serving the national interest, is, I think, the kind of thing we saw, was a pattern we saw with administration. Had they had another 4 years, I think they would have been able to, they'd successfully ironed out a lot of those problems, and we would have seen significant improvements in the way our visa systems run, in the way immigration law is enforced. That didn't happen. The voters didn't go for that, and so now we're going to see the consequences of the new administration. A key consequence we're going to see is increasing disorder at the southern border, because what we saw with the previous administration was a situation that was spinning out of control, especially with people from Central America using asylum as a kind of stratagem, a gimmick to get into the United States, even though most of them didn't qualify and would be rejected. The Trump administration actually got Mexico and Central American countries to cooperate with us in clamping down on that bogus use of asylum basically as a means of illegal immigration. This administration is winding much of that back, and it's going to have consequences. We're already seeing significant numbers of people coming across being let go into the United States. We'll never see them again. Or even if we do, they're not going to leave when their cases are rejected. And it's only going to get worse over the next couple of months.
One more thing on the Trump administration, on the building and the reconstruction and the building of new wall on the border with Mexico. Do you think that whole effort was successful, or did it become a distraction to the Trump administration's efforts on immigration control at the border in general?
Well, I'd say yes to both, in a sense. In other words, I think the president put too much emphasis on the wall, but at the same time, physical barriers at the border are an important tool in controlling illegal immigration and anything else illegally coming across the border. So I think there was too much emphasis put on it. Nonetheless, it is an important, really a vital tool, and the wall that has been built, or rebuilt, as it were, because they replaced in many places 3-foot-high vehicle barriers that your grandma could hop over, with a real, genuine barrier that is very difficult to get across. This was a real advance and an improvement for border security. I'm just afraid that, I feared at the time that the focus on it and the rhetoric centered on it, both pro and con, distracted us from other important aspects of immigration control. For instance, making it harder for illegal immigrants to get jobs, turning that magnet off, which is at least as important as physical border security.
Our guest is Mark Krikorian. He heads the Center for Immigration Studies, with us to talk about the Biden administration's approach to immigration and policy so far. 202-748-8001 is the line to use for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, and for all others, 202-748-8002. Headline in NBC this morning at NBC News: Biden Hill Democrats plan to unveil immigration reform bill this week. The proposal is expected to include an earned pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented immigrants and expand the refugee resettlement program. Before we get to calls, Mark Krikorian, let's take a listen to what Joe Biden has had to say so far in terms of the executive orders issued by the president.
Today I'm going to sign a few executive orders to strengthen the immigration system, building on the executive actions I took on day one to protect dreamers and to end the Muslim ban and to better manage our borders. And that's what these three different executive orders are about. And I want to make it clear, there's a lot of talk, with good reason, about the number of executive orders that I have signed. I'm not making new law. I'm eliminating bad policy. What I'm doing is taking on the issues that 99% of them, that the last president of the United States, issued executive orders I thought were very counterproductive to our security, counterproductive to who we are as a country, particularly in the area of immigration. This is about how America is safer, stronger, more prosperous when we have a fair, orderly, and humane legal immigration system. And with the first action today, we're going to work to undo the moral and national shame of the previous administration that literally, not figuratively, ripped children from the arms of their families, their mothers and fathers at the border, and with no plan, none whatsoever, to reunify the children who are still in custody and their parents. The second action addresses the root causes of our migration to our southern border. And the third action, the third order I'm going to be signing, orders a full review of the previous administration's harmful and counterproductive immigration policies, basically across the board.
Mark Krikorian, the president, saying he's taking these executive actions, in his words, eliminating, quote, eliminating bad policy of the previous administration.
Well, I mean, it's, you know, elections have consequences. It's not as though he's not, you know, he's not doing anything. The Trump administration had policy initiatives, and this administration is attempting to undo pretty much everything, at least rhetorically saying that they're undoing everything President Trump did. Interestingly enough, though, at the border, the Biden administration is keeping a number of Trump policies in place, at least for now, precisely because they were successful in trying to keep down border crossings. The most obvious one is something called, technically they call it Title 42 expulsions. There's no reason to get into the details, but what it amounts is a public health ruling that, because there's a public health emergency, which there obviously is, allowing the Border Patrol to simply turn around anyone it catches and push them back into Mexico, rather than letting them do the, you know, the whole immigration court process. And even though the president himself, when he was running, and the president's supporters have said this is a horrible, evil, you know, Donald Trump policy we have to get rid of, they're not getting rid of it, precisely because if they were to do so, the border crisis, which is going to happen, I mean, I think it's unavoidable, but it would be happening much more quickly, basically blow up in their face, and complicate politically, besides obviously the policy problems with such a border crisis, would complicate politically this week's rollout, as you suggested earlier, of the big legislation that the president and his supporters in Congress intend to introduce, which is to legalize all the illegal immigrants in the United States. Everyone who arrived, at least in the draft that I saw, everyone who arrived as of January 1st of this year. So it's not even people who are firmly established here. It's all illegal immigrants, without any enforcement balance to try to prevent a new illegal population from building up. So the point is, they didn't want that to be, they didn't want the border crisis to be a distraction. So they're actually keeping a number of effective Trump policies in place, which kind of undercuts the rhetoric about how bad and terrible everything President Trump did does.
Some of the bullet points from the White House on that legislation to be introduced in the coming week: the U.S. Citizenship Act, the labor protections. Certain undocumented groups can apply for temporary legal status and a green card after 5 years. Funding to expand integration and inclusion programs. It would eliminate employment-based visa backlogs. It would also provide more technology to expedite screening and identify narcotics. Funding for border agent safety and improved agent professionalism, and increasing efforts to prosecute smuggling and trafficking included in the provisions of that legislation. We've got calls for Mark Krikorian. Let's go first to Michael in Morris, Illinois, independent line.
Good morning. Actually, your guest stole some of my thunder, because I was going to ask why we don't force employers to really verify citizenship or legality to work. But since he touched on that, he can expand. But here's another question. I don't understand, and no one seems to be able to explain to me, the fact that we in no way talk about the negative cultural impact this illegal immigration to our country is having. Okay. Now, my training was as a political scientist and historian. There is no society on the face of the earth that has diversification without corresponding civil unrest and problems among these minority groups. The only solution is a melding of peoples so that you get some harmony in the society. So I want the gentleman to comment on why is it that we are afraid to talk about the cultural impact of this illegal immigration, because that in and of itself is going to destroy the country. It already has, because we're divided right in half, and we don't seem to get it, and we can't even talk to one another about it.
Okay, Michael. Mark Krikorian.
There's 2 points he brought on. First would be let me touch on the assimilation issue. Immigration is successful when assimilation works, when newcomers basically become us and are adopted by us and they adopt us. And that's worked in the past. It still works to a significant degree now, but it's much more difficult when, number one, the numbers are very high. This is regardless of where people come from. And also, number two, when our own institutions are reluctant to basically ask people, look, you need to become us. You need to adopt our history as well as your own. I mean, but publicly, you need to adopt America as your new people. This happens. It's not as though immigrants today are somehow radically different from those of 100 or 200 years ago. The differences really are us. Our educational institutions, our corporate and government institutions are simply reluctant to insist on assimilation, and that needs to change in order for immigration to be successful. As far as the other side goes, the employment thing that he touched on, it is worth mentioning that it was not illegal until 1986 to employ illegal immigrants. That was part of the bargain of the big amnesty that President Reagan signed back then, that those who were here already and established would get green cards, they'd get amnestied, in exchange for prohibiting the employment of illegal immigrants going forward. The problem is that was never enforced, so that deal was kind of a bait and switch. Employers are, in fact, required to verify the legal status of anybody they hire. It's all done on paper, and it's honestly people who want to avoid it, kind of, the employer and the new hire wink at each other, and illegal immigrants can still get hired. This is why we need something mandatory that's now voluntary. It's a system called E-Verify. Online system, it's free. You hire somebody, you just check the information that they already have to give you to see whether it's real. Check with Social Security whether the name, Social Security number, and the date of birth are real and they all match. And there was a measure that was a regulation in the previous administration that never actually got out the door. And I think that was a real failure on the part of the last administration. The regulation would not have made the E-Verify system mandatory, which I think is important. Rather, what it have done is the paper process now that that employers have to do. It's called an I-9 form. They have to fill it out. That instead, that would all be moved online. And what that means is that essentially you could check, the government could check any time whether the person that you hired is in fact legally authorized to work. The name for that regulation was G-Verify, kind of off of the E-Verify that exists now. They never got that out the door. This administration would be well advised to, finalize that regulation and get it out. I don't have a lot of hope they'll do that, but it is essential that the magnet of jobs that pulls illegal immigrants here be weakened as much as possible through that kind of regulation.
We have a viewer in Apache Junction, Arizona, who asked about E-Verify, and what is the reason, he asked, that E-Verify is not mandatory yet?
You'd have to ask the Chamber of Commerce and the farmers and others who don't want it to be mandatory. The fact is that it's a large number of new hires, probably half, maybe more, of new hires in any given year are screened through E-Verify. The problem is the illegal immigrants are all in the other half. That's why it needs to be made a universal thing, basically a labor standard, so that employers now, really wouldn't think about hiring an 11-year-old to go clean a chimney, as would have been the case 100 years ago, because we have internalized the labor standard that you really shouldn't be employing children. Well, illegal immigration, the not employing illegal immigrants also needs to become a labor standard. And one of the important ways to do that is to make E-Verify mandatory. The political problem with that has always been that both the groups on the left that advocate for amnesty and the groups ostensibly on the right, the business organizations, usually say they're okay with E-Verify, mandating it for everybody, only after every illegal immigrant has been legalized, so it wouldn't have any effect on anybody. And that's just not going to work. And so I think one of the important things is, and this is something Senator Grassley, Senator Romney, and others have pushed for, is freestanding legislation to make E-Verify mandatory now, first, before we talk about amnesty. And only then could we have confidence that if you were to amnesty people, you wouldn't, confidence that you wouldn't just end up with another 10 or 11 million illegal immigrants a few years down the road.
Let's go to Rich. Rich is next in Marion, Ohio.
Yeah, interesting conversations here. One curious number I have with New York and their numbers, how many illegals are in our country right now? Is it 11 million, 30 million, 40 million? Do you have any idea? Does anyone have that number, or is this one of these fudge numbers? The other thing is that where we have the people come in with COVID-19 and the problem of giving it to other people. And the other thing is they're in places right now that doesn't have heat in Texas because we're environmentally smart and the windmills are not working. The other part is that a lot of people don't care about sanctuary cities too much. Well, they do, but they're not in their back door. But we know when it starts hitting your front door, you have a different opinion out of it. And we have people that can come in the border, suddenly go to sanctuary cities, and suddenly they're at our front door, just sort of like on D.C. When they're down in, for 9 months somewhere else, I care, but I don't really care. But boy, when they're beating on my front door, I care.
Okay, Rich, Mark Krikorian, on the numbers, first of all.
Yeah, the estimates for the number of illegal immigrants range 10 to 11 to 12 million. People are, they hear that and they say, well, we've been hearing that number for year after year. That can't be right. I think it probably is right. And there's one big reason that it doesn't grow rapidly is that there's a lot of churn in the illegal population. In other words, people stop being illegal pretty frequently. Every year, a lot of them do. And that's because some of them leave, they go home. A small number die. Generally, it's a younger population, so, not the death rate isn't that high, but some, of course, die in a large population. But also, a significant number get green cards every year. Something like in a regular year, last year was different because of COVID, but in a regular year, something like 1 out of 4 new supposedly legal immigrants, people who got green cards in that year, about 1 million a year, something like 1 out of 4 of them are former illegal aliens using the legal immigration system to launder their status. So, I go into all of that to explain there's always a reduction in the illegal population at the same time that new people come in. Now it could be higher. There's organizations estimated something like 13 million or 14 million, I believe. That's possible, but the estimates that are a lot higher, 20, 25 million, that sort of thing, it doesn't seem likely. We've looked at it some, and it's hard to misplace 10 million people, because if the number of illegal immigrants really were that much higher, not just a few million, which you could see, but say 10 million higher than the estimates that exist. You would see it in the birth rates, death rates, school enrollment, grocery store statistics. You'd see it everywhere. Because like I said, it's hard to misplace 10 million people. So I think the estimate of 10 to 12 million illegal immigrants is probably right. Like I said, it could be another million or two beyond that, but it's probably almost certainly not 20 or 30 million people.
If you are a migrant or seasonal or guest worker in the U.S., you come regularly to work in the agriculture industry, or you're working in a plant, does that legal effort somehow raise you up bring you higher up in the line for permanent status in terms of a blue card or other legal status in the United States?
Well, there is no blue card. The blue card thing was a proposal some organizations made. A green card, is the kind of colloquial term for being a regular legal immigrant who eventually could become a citizen. Generally speaking, no. Being a temporary worker doesn't give you a leg up, although there are several visa programs where it does help you get a green card. But you know, if you're, say, a farm worker, that's called an H-2A visa, and you come and go, you know, seasonally, there's no mechanism there to get, you know, for you to get a green card. On the other hand, on an informal sense, you obviously know the ropes. You now have connections and networks in the United States, so it would make it more likely you could get sponsored in some kind of visa status. So formally, no, but informally, probably yes. It does give you an advantage.
Let's hear from Kirk in Oklahoma on the independent line.
Hey, President, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, Kirk, do us a favor. Just mute your volume there on the television, and then go ahead with your comment or question.
Okay, I muted. Okay, what I'm saying, you were saying that Obama administration did lax on immigration, and that's not factual. He speak of when you get out of jail, and that's a fact. When you get out of jail, when you get locked up as an illegal immigrant and you don't have no status, ICE put a detain on you. And before you get released, ICE is right on the doorstep for you, and you go straight in custody. It's law. It's law. So what he says, that's not true. It's a different thing if you go into the county jail and, you know, you have a little simple misdemeanor and they let you out and stuff like that. But no, you don't do a crime, especially if you go do a sentence. From the minute you get locked up, ICE have a detain on you and ICE get you. Here in Oklahoma, you can come down here in Oklahoma and Texas and you see how they do. 4 o'clock in the morning, ICE is at your door. So don't tell me Obama was labeled as the deporter in chief. So when you come and say that, oh, he was lax, no. People got deported for non-violent crime, nothing, and they didn't have status. So what you're saying is just sending some talking points to people who get wild up about immigration and hate on immigrants and all of that. And that's not factual. Immigrants played a pivotal part in the United States. You wouldn't have an Eli Musk if the Trump administration way was the way how we got it. You wouldn't have an Eli Musk who actually sits on one of the world's richest men today.
Kirk will get a response from Mark Krikorian. He called President Obama, former President Obama, and I think it was a headline earlier this week, as the deporter in chief. Was that a record of the Obama administration?
The answer is yes and no. The Clinton and Bush administrations had made consistent investment in immigration enforcement, and the number of illegal immigrants and some legal immigrants who were criminals, the number of people deported grew consistently, pretty much straight through the through the Clinton and Bush administrations. Obama inherited that high level of immigration, high level of deportation, and basically kept it sort of high for several years, even though they played some statistical games to keep it high at that same level. It sort of plateaued. But the point was to show that they were tough on immigration. in order to politically be able to make the case for the amnesty bill that the president favored. The Gang of Eight bill is what it came to be called because of the 8 senators who sponsored it.
Yeah.
When that bill failed, deportation, they stopped pretending. And deportations from inside the country, which is not just people right at the border, collapsed, dramatically fell. And so really the deporter-in-chief label was deployed against President Obama by his own supporters to try to kind of force him away from seeming tough on immigration. He never really earned it. And I think that the Obama administration didn't actually mind that much when the National Council of La Raza came up with the term deporter-in-chief, because they saw it as a way of seeming tough to people who were skeptical of Obama. But once the possibility of that bill in the Senate disappeared, they went back to, they sort of reverted to form and basically stopped deporting people except those who were the most serious criminals. So that if you were an illegal immigrant and you weren't a criminal, you basically were able to stay. And openly, the head of ICE had said that. The Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said that being an illegal immigrant is not reason enough to be deported, which of course is ludicrous and is contrary to law. And yet that is the perspective, frankly, of that administration and of this one.
Next up is Ray, Raleigh, North Carolina, on the Republican line.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
I have a question. I believe one of the reasons that Mexico had to hold the people over the border was because the UN made that pact with other countries that refugees can come to their country, and Trump didn't sign it. So here's my question. Why isn't the UN protecting our border? They made the pact with all these other countries for refugees to come in. Why aren't they protecting our border? And I must tell all Americans, stop using the excuse of illegal immigrants. That country is full of cartels, drug dealers, murderers. Why is that on us? Why should we have sympathy? America is known to fight for righteousness all the time. Why are we taking up for people that's running over here with cartels, knowing who the cartels members are, and they're not fighting for their whole country? I call them a coward. Blacks have been fighting in this country since the Revolutionary War and fought in every war for this country, and yet you put the refugees in front of us.
Okay, Ray in North Carolina, and on that, Mark Krikorian, in a similar vein from Mike in Osbury Park, New Jersey, asking, Mexico and Central American countries are more than happy to let illegal immigrants come to the U.S. so they can be our problem. What is the U.S. doing to stop this?
Yeah, the core issue here is, and this was the first caller referred to this, is a treaty. It's not the UN made us do anything. It's a UN treaty that we signed and that most countries have signed on refugees and asylum. Asylum, just to make clear what we're talking about, is basically a person who gets here on his own, usually an illegal immigrant, who says, you have to treat me as a refugee, I'm now here on your doorstep. Whereas our refugee program is where we go abroad and find refugees, bring them here. Asylum is where an illegal immigrant sneaks across the border and says, you can't deport me because I'm claiming asylum. And the problem is that we, and this administration is actually proposing to expand whom we give this asylum to. And the result is basically undoing the various immigration limits and controls that Congress has passed. Because if Congress has legislated, which it has, that there should be a certain number of immigrants, different categories of different numbers, what asylum represents is an illegal immigrant saying, I really don't care what your numerical limits are, you have to let me in anyway. And the problem is that we have been expanding who qualifies for asylum, because the categories for it, most of them are pretty self-explanatory. You're fleeing because of your political opinion, you're persecuted because of your religion or your race, your nationality. Those are pretty clear-cut, and I think there's support for that. There's a fifth ground for asylum called you're being persecuted because of what it calls membership in a particular social group, which basically is a catch-all. It means anything a judge wants it to mean. And we have now been giving asylum under this basically almost meaningless, amorphous category to all kinds of people who, never were conceived of as legitimate asylum recipients. For instance, a woman who is a victim of domestic violence. Her boyfriend beats her up. This is a terrible thing. But asylum is not an appropriate vehicle for that. There was a case a number of years ago, a handicapped young man from Pakistan got asylum. Some judge gave him asylum because he said, well, in his country, handicapped people were treated poorly. And they were. Much of the world is really pretty backwards in that regard. But asylum is not a tool for social reform abroad. And that really is, I think, one of the central issues we're going to have to face as a government and as a people going forward is what do we do about asylum? Because the more expansive we define asylum as, and the Europeans are seeing this too, the less control we can have over our own borders. And so, this administration and whatever comes afterwards is going to be facing some difficult questions about how we deal with this issue of asylum.
Next call is from Richmond, Indiana. This is Summer on the Republican line.
Good morning.
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 My question is, who's going to pay for their medical costs when they get over here?
You are. That's basically what it amounts to. The question sort of put more broadly is, what do we do about newcomers, however they got here? What do we do about them if they can't pay their own bills? And the law has existed for generations that people shouldn't be allowed to immigrate. We should not be letting people come in who can't pay their own bills, who can't support themselves. That's the first principle of immigration law, literally going back to the 1600s. What the previous administration did, what the Trump administration did, was try to put some, flesh on the bones of that idea. And they put together a very extensive rule about what qualifies you as, to be judged not to be able to pay your own bills, likely to be using welfare. And it was a well thought out, detailed rule. They took public comments. It wasn't nearly as stringent as it could have been. And yet this administration wants to undo it. And in fact, even before this administration came in, a judge somewhere put the thing on hold. So, I go back to the answer I gave first, which is that you, the taxpayer, is going to be supporting immigrants who can't pay their own bills. And that's not because they're bad people. They're not here to rip us off. There's really very few people who come here because they want to get American welfare. The problem is they're a mismatch for a modern society like ours. People with little education get jobs that don't pay very much. They work. They're not sitting around eating bonbons. They work. But they just can't get paid that much because they're not that educated and so don't produce the kind of economic output that would warrant higher pay, which means that they're going to end up having to rely on American taxpayers to feed their children. And, there's no bad guys there, but why would we want to continue a policy like that brings in newcomers who can't pay their own bills when we have plenty of Americans who need that kind of support?
Our guest is the Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies, Mark Krikorian. Thanks for being with us this morning.
Thank you.